All right, as people come in, just want to say thank you for joining us. Feel free to have your video on. If you don't want to have it on, that's okay as well. Try to keep yourselves muted. And as far as just other house rules, we will be using the chat feature if you'd like to have a question. If you want to unmute yourself, you can use the raise hand feature and we'll try to get to you for those ones. But excited to see everybody joining. As you join too, try to be interactive with the chat. Again, we want to make this as interactive as possible between the students and our clinician for tonight. So we could start off with typing in, where you're from, where you're watching this from. If you are SPT, SPTA, what year you are, anything along those realms would be definitely helpful. Okay, class of 2024. So as people start to type in the chat, I just want to go ahead and introduce us. So again, thank you all for coming tonight. And then for those who are watching the recording later on, this is the first APTA Student Social of the Year for 2022. We're having this one on Olympic athletes, so definitely excited for this discussion tonight. We are here with D Cristino, and I would like to hand off the mic to him just so he can talk a little bit about himself before we head into some questions.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and I'm honored to be here. It's been a while since I've been a student, but I can certainly remember the struggles and the moments and the excitement of being in school and becoming a PT eventually. So to date myself, I've been practicing 19 years, going on 20 years. And so the year I graduated was right before the DPT started to kind of come into play at a few universities. So it's come a long ways. So I've been pretty lucky in my career where I started out in sports medicine pretty early. And one of my first jobs was at the base of a ski slope where I worked with the emergency room, and we would see anywhere from, on average 10 to 15 ski injuries, acute ski injuries a day. So I got really well versed in multitasking and dealing with acute injuries. And I can't tell you how many knee assessments I've done. So I could do that with my eyes closed and probably my hands tied behind my back nowadays. So so those experiences, along with just having some great CIs in during my student years, and then some great mentors along the way, landed a lot of opportunities for me. Where eventually, I've started out in Vail, Colorado, and we worked with a lot of actually elite athletes that came through the Stedman Clinic. So right off the bat, I got exposed to professional athletes and Olympic athletes, and we had quite a program there that you could learn a lot from. They have since transitioned to a sports fellowship program, which I would highly recommend that you guys check out. But that experience eventually landed me at Stanford University, and I played a role in helping develop the outpatient orthopedic department for the general public. So that was something that they didn't have, and the opportunity was to develop a program, and it literally started with me in a small little room and my director, and then we grew that into 13 therapists and a brand new space, and eventually we outgrew that. And I eventually transitioned to the athletic department side, was recruited by one of the football team physician. And so I was the head PT for the football team there at Stanford, as well as the cross country and track and field team for several years. So maybe I'll kind of stop there and see where we want to take this.
Awesome. So before we head into the questions, Zofia put in a doc in the chat. So that is for everyone to connect with each other. It has all of your names already on there. So if you would like to use it, you can go on there, add in your year, your SPT, SPTA, and then your Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook handles. But as far as questions, we can start with one. And then again, for anyone who's interested in asking a question, you can put it in the chat or use the raise hand feature. But you kind of already alluded to there was a certain fellowship that students get involved in. But for those who are interested in working with Olympic athletes in the future, are there any additional certifications or credentials that you would recommend getting?
Yeah, so I started pursuing the OCS, and I can just say that, man, that preparing for that exam, to sit for that exam, I mean, first of all, as you all know, you need a certain amount of hours of exposure and experience to even sit for it. And then studying for it took it to a level where, I mean, even if you say didn't pass the first time, you learned quite a bit. And I think that's really builds a foundation to build from. Like I felt after that, achieving the OCS, I could handle pretty much almost any, general orthopedic condition that came my way. So that gave me a lot of confidence. And I think you take that into and you apply it to sports medicine. So I eventually pursued this SCS. And if you're going to work with a sports team, I would highly recommend the SCS. And I won't say, pursue that over the OCS, because I think it's a good marriage between the two. I think the OCS before the SCS is my sort of preference. But the SCS gives you a sort of a wealth of knowledge that you don't get in school, or at least I didn't, and put you in certain situations where, especially for me, so I act as our national team PT as well as the medical manager. So there's conditions that you're not maybe addressing directly as a physical therapist, but it gives you knowledge of how to handle certain situations, especially acute situations, or even some minor medical things matters, and then what's the best action plan, especially when you're traveling with a team and say you don't have a team physician with you or other personnel with you. So, so those would be the two certifications I would highly recommend. I'm currently pursuing my CSCS, and I think that's more because our team, which is kind of I won't say in its infancy, but in terms of having a medical support and things like, basic things like coaches, like a head coach, an assistant coach, and team manager for our national climbing team, those just got into play the last 2 or 3 years. To just show you how young we all are to this team. So eventually, one day, if we have the budget and the resources, we'll probably employ like a dedicated strength and conditioning coach. But for me, I think physical therapists have such a good knowledge of, how do we rehabilitate people and progress them in terms of tissue healing and tissue loading. And so I think if you play that role as a sports physical therapist, you're going to sort of like blend into as they sort of return to practice and training. And that's like my experience at Stanford was working really closely with the strength and conditioning and performance coaches, and speaking the same language was really helpful. So I could understand, what would be their progressions, and I can sort of direct their return to lifting or conditioning or even to practice. And within working with a large team where you have multiple disciplines like that, if you can speak the same language, then they'll have a lot of confidence in you. So and then I would lastly say, maybe not lastly, but what I do mostly, especially when I travel with the team, is hands-on treatment. So a lot of manual therapy, from a lot of myofascial work, and really dedicated to more of recovery and dealing with any nags and those things. And I would say that's probably about 80% of what I do. And we can later discuss what a normal day looks like for me on the road. But I would say those would be top priority in my book. So.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for that. There was one question kind of earlier when you were talking about your pathway. Where exactly in Vail did you work?
I worked with Howard Head Sports Medicine. So they have their head clinic, or their main clinics based out of Vail, and then they have last time I checked, they had like 9 or 10 satellite clinics throughout Eagle and Summit County, if you're familiar with Colorado. So that basically extends from sort of the ski resorts of Keystone and Breckenridge all the way sort of west of Vail. So as you can imagine, we dealt with a lot of ski and snowboard. The U.S. ski and snowboard team would often train right down the road at Copper Mountain. So that's kind of where I started my career. And as part of what's called now Vail Health, the big umbrella is the Stedman Clinic. Back in the day, it was called Stedman Hawkins, but Richard Stedman was kind of a pioneer of sort of revolutionary knee arthroscopy procedures. And then now, like, they have a couple other therapists like Mark Philippon physicians who specialize in really unique procedures that, you can only get at that clinic. So you can imagine the sort of the clientele that would come through there. So.
Awesome. And we have a question from the audience. So would you recommend Rezdy Right after graduation to get the OCS certification, or did you do that on your own? Before answering that, I will say we do have APTA Live coming up that we'll talk about announcements later that will kind of get you a little bit about residencies and fellowships. But Zach, how would you answer that question?
Like, I did it on my own because back in the day, there wasn't residencies like they are now. But having played a little role in development of a fellowship or residency in Vail, I could see just a tremendous value of doing a residency beyond just preparing for the OCS or the SCS, which it helps you. They would do weekly study groups and things like that. You would get, at least in Vail, you had the opportunity to have sort of on the, quote unquote, on the field event coverage, which is really, it's a requirement to sit for the SCS. And we can talk about that later, but as part of the program, you're kind of, checking off the boxes. And then in addition to the mentorship that you get through a residency program. So if I had to do it all over, not that I felt like I made a mistake or anything, but just because you guys have the resources now. And I think to have sort of that leadership and that guidance certainly can take a burden off you in terms of what should you be doing. And so.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question. So how often do you travel, and have you found or heard of any other opportunities that don't require you to travel as often?
So when I worked at Stanford, we never traveled with the team. I mean, they had dedicated athletic trainers. Usually some teams had several. So we never had the requirement to travel, and it's probably a little unheard of, I think, in terms of major professional teams. The climbing world is a little different in that what was interesting when I started, so through like my employment in Vail, we had developed an agreement with the national governing body, which is USA Climbing, and that's who I work for now, because they didn't really have the ability to, say, have a physical therapist or even medical staff of any sorts in-house. So they would outsource it, or the athletes would have to find a physician or a therapist on their own. So the way we started was, what we noted was that pretty much all the national climbing teams abroad, and back then you only had maybe a couple, would travel with therapists and sometimes massage therapists. And it seemed that's what they valued the most, or if they had to bring one person, that was the person that they would utilize the most. So yes, you could bring a team physician, but in reality, the person who's probably getting the most work is the physical therapist. So that's kind of how it sort of progressed. And slowly, as I started to travel with the team, just for like a couple events a year, which is only a fraction of how much they compete internationally. You would just see this growing, like, the next year, a few more teams will be bringing physical therapists, and nowadays it's like every team that you can think of has a physio, as they say. So, but for me, like, we have a World Cup season. It's much like skiing. And so our season will start in April. And because we only have probably 1 or 2 World Cups that happen in the States, the other, say, 12 to 14 that happen in a year occur abroad and throughout Asia, mostly in Europe, because climbing kind of has a rich sort of history there. So we're usually on the road every other week, and sometimes we're away for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, depending on the World Cups where they are. Like, so for instance, in Europe, in July there'll be 3 events in France and Switzerland, and then sometimes when we go to Asia, there'll be one in Seoul, and then there'll be one in Tokyo. So we travel a lot, but that's, I would say, out of the ordinary for a physical therapist or team physical therapist. Yeah.
Kind of going off of that, explaining how you're saying that this is sort of a new role that you've had, what kind of made you choose that this was the sport that you want to work with and the opportunity that you wanted to take?
Yeah, so I started climbing. I mean, if you ask some of the athletes nowadays, the elite climbers, I got to it pretty late in life. But I started climbing in undergrad, even before, I knew I wanted to become a physical therapist. And so when I eventually got into PT school a couple years later, and I mean, at that time, you're sort of overwhelmed with the knowledge that you're gaining and just learning the skills, and eventually worrying about passing your licensure exam and then finding a job. So you're really just focused on becoming a therapist. And that first year, you're learning so much on the job. So I didn't even think about climbing being something I would pursue as a sports physical therapist. And I think that was probably a good thing because, I mean, number one, like climbing therapists, I mean, I didn't even know of one in the US anyway. So it was sort of a niche that was just kind of sitting there. And climbing's not a lucrative sport, so it doesn't get a lot of attention like it is getting now. It was more of like a lifestyle hobby. And yes, you had professional climbers, but people don't realize, professional climbers don't make a lot of money and usually have second jobs. So you basically kind of just got engrossed with all the sports that there was already a lot of literature about, and you would learn just how to deal with sort of those demographics and their own set of epidemiology and pathologies. And so for me, like not to just dive into one sport, I think was really valuable for me because I got exposed to many different types of sports, many different types of injuries and scenarios, which led to just this exposure that again builds your confidence because you're getting to see all these different things. And you will find that there's just all these similarities in terms of how you approach each sport, in terms of rehab protocols and progressions and some of the basic things you learn along the way. There's a lot of overlap. The sports are unique in their own way with their set of injuries that they have, and you have to be creative sometimes if you work with, say, like a hammer thrower versus a gymnast, and that's kind of the fun part. You get to almost every day. When I worked at Stanford, if people aren't familiar with Stanford, they have 36 teams and over 900 athletes. So so imagine like getting to see and work with all these different types of sports, and it just kind of kept you on your toes. So
definitely sounds like an awesome opportunity. We have a few questions in the chat, so we'll go with the first one. And also thank you to Alyssa, Catherine, and Barbara for asking questions. But the next one is from Danny. So how much does a PT's experience with a particular sport or sports in general influence their ability to work or be hired with that sport?
That's a good question. I know with climbing, it's much preferred if people are experienced with climbing. And not to say you have to be, say, a climber yourself. But there are some unique injuries with climbers that you don't see in other sports. And again, like going back to how you would rehabilitate those injuries, the basic principles are very similar: tissue loading, healing time, things like that. The things that may be different is, well, how do you go about, progressive loading and sort of return to training / practice? How do you clear them? When do you say they're full go? So, and that's kind of still in works for our sport of climbing. I can't really speak to some of the other sports. I would just say on an Olympic level, you'll have, I would say your competition is going to be stiff. And if, say, you have two people with equal skills and equal experience in terms of years and practice and maybe the same certifications, then it might come down to who has the most experience within that sport. But I always say that I'd rather have an experienced and skilled PT, and then they can learn the sport, versus someone who maybe is less experienced as a PT in general, and say that they are a specialist in the sport, if that makes sense. So, but yeah, I can't. Yeah, it's hard to speak to each sport, obviously. So,
absolutely. There's another question from Tim, and he is asking, would you mind talking about scope of practice and interprofessional teamwork between PTs, athletic trainers, strength and conditioning coaches in the context of an Olympic athlete and return to sport?
Yeah, so I'll admit, like with the Olympic athlete, well, maybe I won't talk about climbing. I'll talk about some of the other Olympic athletes that I worked with, and not necessarily going to the Olympics with them. But for us, there's a lot of skiers and snowboarders and track and field. So probably the experience that I had was, it was very collaborative. For instance, at Stanford, we were lucky enough to have the team physicians clinics were right next door to us. And then if we walked across the street would be the athletic department, the athletic trainers department. And alongside that was the performance coaches. So we would have usually multiple times a week meetings about the athletes. And it was just always this sort of conversation of, and not in a sort of a pressured kind of way, is just, what can I do with them now? So if I'm like having a sort of a talk with a performance coach or the strength and conditioning coach, it would be something like, okay, this person can start to do this kind of lift with you, or we might need to modify that kind of lift based on where they are. And then this is what I'm doing with them, the athlete. So it's almost like, I would say, like, I'm always like a couple steps ahead of what they're doing with, say, the strength and conditioning coach. And then the athletic trainer it was more of just, I never had a sort of a competitive sort of experience with them, and that we were all in it together to help the athlete get better. So even if they say they did some hands-on treatment that maybe, if you want to get kind of nitpicky, maybe kind of overlap to our scope. For me, it was more of that if they can service that athlete 2 or 3 times a day, where they can't do that with me because my schedule wouldn't allow it, then we were all for it. So so for me, like we weren't too territorial about our scopes of practice. I mean, we're respectful, of course, but for me, it was, I know historically there was friction, but I had a good experience, and hopefully that's, you know, globally. So I don't know. Maybe I was just in a little bubble where I was sort of nice, happy family. So
Definitely have heard about that, but definitely thank you for giving us some more insight. So before we head on to some of the more questions, we're going to head into some announcements. So I'm going to hand over the mic to our current nominating committee chair-elect, Zofia.
Hi, everyone. So like Teo said, my name is Zofia, and I'm actually going to start by handing it off to our Director of Communications, Casey, to tell us a little bit about our upcoming APTA live event at the end of January.
Thanks, Sophia. Hi, everyone. My name is Casey. As Sophia said, I'm the current Director of Communications for the Student Assembly Board of Directors. So on January 30th at 7 p.m., we're going to be having our first APTA Live of the year, and it's going to be on fellowships and residencies. So as of right now, we have 3 panelists that are going to be joining us, and they all have different backgrounds: sports, manual therapy, D1 residencies. So if you'd like to learn more about that, or if you're kind of on the fence about if you want to start a residency after school or what your options are, definitely tune in. There will be a link on the student members page on Instagram to RSVP to that event.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Casey. A couple more quick announcements. So CSM advanced registration deadline is going to be January 17th at midnight. So make sure you guys register before then. A little reminder, you can attend either in person or on demand throughout March. And then speaking of CSM, there are going to be a couple student-specific events at CSM. First one is going to be on Thursday, February 3rd from 6 to 8 a.m. We'll be having the student networking breakfast where you can grab food, coffee, meet other students, connect with them, and we'll even have a town hall with our new APTA president, Roger Herr. And then on Friday, February 4th from 6:30 to 7:30 p.m., you can grab a bite to eat and enjoy another energetic, fun event called the Student Ignite event. And you can find more details about both of these events under the programming tab of the CSM page on the APTA website. And then one thing that I just recently found out about is APTA members have access through their membership to Active and Fit Direct, where you can stay active at home, a gym, or anywhere for just $25 a month, plus a one-time enrollment fee and applicable taxes. So this can be really handy if you're traveling all over the place. Most major gyms, I believe, are connected with Active and Fit Direct, or at least in my area, and you can type in your zip code and find out which gyms near you are participating. But if you want to see more info about that, you can hit that link that Tyler just put in the chat. And with that, I will hand it back off to Teo.
Yes, thank you. And before we actually go back into things, I just want to give a quick shout out to the board. So the APTA Student Board of Directors, we have a few students who serve on the board with us tonight. So just wanted to say thank you. And if you all want to introduce yourselves in the chat, you can. So we got Tyler Axelson, who was putting in some of those links. He is our nominating committee member. Like Sophia said, she is the nominating committee chair-elect, and I'm the nominating committee chair. We have Devin Morris, who is our secretary. Casey, who was just on before, she is our director of communications. And we have Chase, who is our president. So if you are looking to get involved, whether that's locally or nationally, feel free to reach out to any of us and we can definitely help you along those realms. So heading back into the questions, and again, you can unmute yourself. You're probably sick of hearing my voice and saying all of the questions anyway. So if you are open to doing that, you definitely can raise your hand to ask a question. But we're going to go into the question from Mary. So do you have any recommendations for things we can do now as students to set ourselves up for getting our foot in the door, for lack of a better term, to work in sports after graduation?
I mean, I think one of the things, I mean, I'll again use climbing just because I tend to get a lot of questions like this with how did I get to where I am with the climbing team, and I can say like the things that I did that helped me get to where I am were to volunteer at certain competitive events, and just to get the exposure to meet people. For us, there's a big youth climbing sort of community in terms of teams, and it's continuing to grow. So usually I recommend the student or the a new grad PT is to reach out to your local team, especially like a youth team, because they're going to be usually the ones that are underserved. And it's a good way to get to know like a young athlete that, who knows, you might be working with them throughout a much of their career, or and maybe they make it to the Olympics one day or to a professional team one day. So I think like that's one thing that I think is out there that not only will help you sort of make yourself known within that sport and on a local level, but also it starts to, like I said, with the SCS especially, and not just for the SCS, but to work with a sports team, event coverage is a really valuable experience and a fun experience. So in whatever capacity, I know like for us, when we host a national championship event, and from the medical side, I'm helping organize that, and we get more and more, it seems like we're getting more and more medical related requests in terms of volunteers, whereas obviously you can imagine there's a lot of volunteer positions to help run the event, and maybe that's where it starts. So you get to meet that, that person, that coach, the VP of sports, or so that would be one thing, is reaching out to like your local youth teams, and it's not as probably as exciting as right off the bat working with a collegiate or professional team, but it's certainly with that experience, and when it comes time, like that's going to be noticeable to someone that you gave your time. And I know we all have limited time, especially as students, but that was probably one thing that they noted with me, was that I was willing to sacrifice, I guess sacrifice is a strong word, but spend my free time learning the sport and getting to know these young athletes and servicing the sport. So
there's a question that kind of you answered it a little bit, but if you can elaborate more on it. Madison is asking, what's the best way to begin working with elite athletes, such as Olympians or professional teams? Do you recommend starting in a certain realm right out of PT school, say outpatient ortho, to a college professional team, or what do you think is the best way to get to that elite level of athlete?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I don't even know if there's really sort of a cookie cutter sort of process with that. I mean, if right offhand that you're going to want to go into and work with eventually a sports team, then obviously it makes sense to try to put yourself in a sports medicine environment if you can right out of school. I know that's not, I don't know how competitive the market is nowadays, but I know sports medicine was always a competitive sort of job, especially for new grads. I think that for me helped me a lot. And you at least get to learn a lot of the principles. And even though you might not always be working with, say, athletes, and especially elite athletes right off the bat, but what you're seeing is a lot of sports medicine practices and principles that trickle down to the general public. And so that's a really good foundation to gain. And then I think, in terms of just working with athletes in general, kind of alluding back to my previous answer, I don't know how easy it is to say, even after a year or two of experience, to be able to work with a collegiate team, or much less a professional team, just because I imagine the competition is going to be stiff. You're going to have a lot of strong resumes out there, and unfortunately with more experience. So I think that's sort of the tough pill to swallow every time I tell a student that. but I think is just trying to get those experiences to then eventually to be competitive, to be one of those resumes that they, makes the final round. So hopefully that answers some of the questions. So.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. There's another question from Melanie, and she's asking, what are your thoughts on sports residencies, if you have any? So I know you said earlier you preferred OCS and then SCS in terms of certification, but what are your thoughts specifically on sports residencies?
I think they're tremendous, and I might be a little biased, and I have nothing to compare it to because it was within the sort of the environment that I worked in, and the residency that they had put together and the curriculum, and I know that I had mentored a couple PTs who are now just doing tremendous in sort of that world. So what I could see, even though I never participated in the residency, I had a small part in, say, study groups or literature review, and then just what I would see in terms of their ability to do, like I said, things like event coverage, and just the mentorship that they got was huge. So I think it's like, I'm not saying everyone should do it, but I think it would set you up really well if you can do a sports res. And again, it's, if you think about these certifications and those kinds of experiences, not that it should drive, they shouldn't be like the motivating factor to do these things, but again, if you're jockeying for that position to work with whatever sports team, then those things kind of add up and make you stand out. So.
All right, we have our first raised hand. So Chase, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question, feel free to do so.
Thanks, Tayo. And sorry, it's me and not somebody else. I know you hear my voice all the time, but hi, Zach. Thanks. This has been really awesome. And I know that kind of so far you've been giving us a lot of advice, but I'd love to hear if you have any just like good stories, good patient stories, good successes, something that like went really well. And then it's kind of a second question because I don't want to talk again. But I think a lot of people on this call are here because we're excited about the prospect of potentially working with these elite level athletes. Is there anything that you would say you didn't expect that maybe kind of knocked down the prestige or like the glamorousness of working with Olympic level athletes that might be something good to know before we, attempt to pursue this?
Well, maybe I'll start by answering that question.
Sure.
So there's probably a handful of sports, Olympic sports that are lucrative. And so the eye opener is, and maybe you've read some of these stories. I know for like Lola Jones, who, did track and field, and then she transitioned to, I think it was bobsled. And it was kind of somewhat made public, but she went from a sport where you can make millions, if you got like in the diamond league, as they call it, to a sport where you barely can pay rent. So I think the eye opener there was and this is one of the questions I got in sort of the document I was sent, was one of the things that was really sort of profound and unique and fun of working with Olympic athletes was the sacrifice they make. Like I said, some of them are holding a couple jobs just to make ends meet, and training, and working with their therapist. And so that was an eye opener. Like, I don't think people realize that, especially to get to the Olympics, much less being an Olympian, is not sort of a lot of glamour and sort of a lot of sort of lucrative business. So that was kind of an eye opener. And then probably just maybe a little antidote and funny story was when I went to Tokyo, and we had, for a little background, like our sport of climbing made its debut in Tokyo. So we had put in a bid several years ago, and then eventually it was accepted. So Tokyo was our first Olympics for any climbing related staff or athlete, which was pretty exciting. And so we had no idea what to expect, other than we were just glad to be there. So you get to the Olympic Village, and mind you, this is unique because of COVID. It's not like you're in a fancy hotel room. You're in kind of a dorm room that's kind of made of cardboard and box, and even our beds were, for really good reasons, from like a recycling and sort of environmental reasons, our beds were made of cardboard. So and they did support us, but so that's like a little funny story. So yeah, I think the Olympics has, I guess, this image to a lot of people that it's like really posh, and it's not. It's a lot of hard work too, as you can imagine. I mean, probably we can go into this later, but the days are long, and especially this Olympics was unique because of like each team, and I was sort of that person. We had to be what was called a COVID liaison officer. So we were responsible for testing the staff and the athletes every day, and dropping it off at the drop-off points, and obviously trying to keep everyone safe. And and we were in quarantine. So it was, I think, even the traveling part, when I traveled with the national team, we're staying in, sometimes little dingy hotels, and you're constantly on the go, and you're dealing with jet lag all the time. And, so it's not as luxurious as people think. And you get pretty exhausted by the time you get done.
Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it.
So you kind of started to talk a little bit about your experience in the Olympics. Could you go a little bit further in explaining what a typical day would look like during the Olympics?
Yeah, so for us, our event, like I said, this was a really unique one because of COVID. So maybe I'll kind of just start. We had a host city, which I think national governing bodies can put a bid in for and work with the locals. So for us, it was in Hachiochi, which is about 45 minutes, I believe, west of Tokyo. And because of COVID, we had to quarantine for 2 weeks. But we did have the ability to go from our hotel to the training areas that we had secured. So we had to do a little reconnaissance, and we secured like a little climbing gym area, and then there was this outdoor sort of venue we could train. So for 2 weeks, we basically went from hotel to training area, and that's it. So we couldn't go to grocery stores, we couldn't go sightseeing and go to restaurants and things like that. So that was quite unique. I don't think the Olympics is normally like that, and hopefully Paris won't be like that. So so you can have a little fun. But a typical day would be, even not just at the Olympics, but when I travel with a team, and they're very similar, is that basically the athletes kind of get up anywhere from, some get up at 7, some get up at 10, and we structure a training session either 1 or 2 times a day. And so like my day starts usually, I'm up by 6 or 7, and if it's not a competition day, so I usually check in with the athletes, see how they're feeling, how they're recovering. And this is kind of where your SCS kind of comes into play, in your sports science. Just we talk about just general nutrition and hydration and preparing for the day. For me, it's preparing all the equipment, so treatment tables and modalities that we can travel with. And I travel with a med kit with tape, gauze, band-aids, super glue, you name it, for climbers. So So most of the time, I'm available to the athletes during the training session. And in that role, it's more of acting as the first responder. So, and that's probably a quick plug-in for if you want to pursue what's called an EMR certification, which probably most of you know what that is. That's not a bad thing to have either. It's one of those things I say, hopefully you'll never have to use, but it's darn good if you have that knowledge if something does happen. So I'm there as the first responder most of the times because there's not, like, we don't have a team physician traveling with us, and there's usually not a medical person around. So obviously if someone falls and sprains their ankle, or luckily in our sport, we don't see concussions and those kind of things yet. And then as they're climbing and training, they'll usually approach me if they're feeling sort of a nag or a tweak, and you kind of do sort of on-site assessments. And that's kind of where, again, like your manual skills kind of come into play. And, or you say, hey, when we get back to the hotel, let's take a further look. And then you do your patient education, assign them a few things, and maybe you're doing some rehabilitation on the road during that trip. So luckily that doesn't happen too often, as we try to be preventative as much as we can and do those things before we hit the road. So so after, they get done with training and they eat and bathe, then they usually approach me at the end of the day. It's a little bit of downtime. Sometimes they're bored, and it's who doesn't want a little, TLC at the end of the day. So that's where I, usually from 7 to as late as sometimes 11. I kind of cut them off at 11 unless it's emergency, just because we know how important sleep is for recovery. So I just try to get them in bed, or at least trying to fall asleep by 10 o'clock. And so we'll do a lot of the treatment. And again, it's a kind of a lot of hands-on treatment usually, and a lot of patient education. We travel with certain, quote unquote recovery tools. So it's educating them how to use those and timing and things like that. So, and then you repeat the next day. During a competition day, the competitions, say during what we have a qualifications round. So that's when you'll see, the most athletes compete in a day. And that's, on average at a World Cup, that's like over 100 men and 100 women, over 100 women. So the competition can run 5-6 hours sometimes. But the day starts usually around 7:30. And the athletes have to go into this, what we call an isolation area. And once they enter the isolation area, they can't leave. So they basically, and there's a cutoff time, so they have to be there at a certain time. And if you don't make it, they can't compete. So it's a pretty hard deadline in terms of getting up and making sure they all get there and that we get there as well. So, and then after the competition, which sometimes ends at 4, sometimes ends at 10. And if they're drug tested, they make the podium. Then they're drug tested. And then sometimes that goes on to midnight. So they can be, sometimes 16-hour days for sure. But that's what probably a typical sort of day looks like. The Olympics wasn't quite that intensive because you had much less athletes. We had 42 men plus and women combined. So in terms of the competition was much shorter, but again, to give you sort of a reference of how days can go, luckily, or not, maybe not luckily, but fortunately, we got a silver medal, one of our men, and he went, another funny story, he went to, get drug tested, and he, couldn't perform. And we got done at 2 a.m. So we were walking through the village and at 2 a.m. when it was just dead silent, and it was kind of a cool experience. So
that's awesome. Thank you for sharing. Ashley, you can go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question.
I just want to say thank you for spending your time to give us some of your experience. But for when you were in PT school and the clinical rotations that you did you have an area of focus that you wanted to go into and kind of focus your clinicals based on that? Or did you kind of do the opposite or a mixture of both? And what would you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, as probably most curriculums, I would imagine you have to fulfill certain ones, right? For us, it was like the underserved population. And then I did have a focus more on orthopedics, maybe not quite sports medicine, but it was certainly orthopedics. So, and then I branched out a little bit, and mostly just because I was exploring, and you always have sort of that thought: is this really the right path, or is there something hidden out there that might capture my attention more? And so I did actually home health pediatrics during one of my last internships. But I think for me, like having been an athlete all my life, and sports was just part of my identity, and just growing up watching the Olympics, and where I grew up, I grew up in North Carolina, so we had the Tar Heels. Sorry if anyone from Duke is here, but it just seemed just natural to take that path. So there was a little bit of emphasis. Yeah.
Thank you.
Another question we got from the chat from Morgan was, do you have any insight on PTs and Paralympic athletics? You know of any PTs working in adaptive athletics, and if their knowledge base tends to be a mixture of orthopedic and neuro, or do they tend to specialize more in one versus the other?
Gosh, I wish I could answer that. The really cool thing is we're kind of almost in the process of looking, or I should say I am, in our medical committee, is looking at that, because we do have a national paraclimbing team, and not quite to the extent of the able-bodied teams, but they do have a World Cup season as well, and they have a World Championships every year. And paraclimbing is one sport I think is trying to put in its bid to the Olympics eventually. So I don't think it will happen by 2024, but maybe LA 28 is maybe a possibility. And for those who have never watched paraclimbing, YouTube it. It's amazing to watch. As you can imagine, there's a lot of different classifications. I kind of forgot the actual classification, but for those visually impaired, that's a pretty cool thing to see a climber climb who's visually impaired. So, but to answer the question, my thought is I would expect that it's its own sort of specialty. So what I gather is it's kind of a blend of neurology and for paraclimbing, it's having a knowledge about prosthetics. And so I can easily say, like, I would not be the person for the job, even though I serve as our national team PT for our able-bodied team, and I'm the medical manager, but I know when I'm in over my head. So what I want to do is find that right person for them. Once we can get to a point where we can contract someone, or eventually hire someone to travel with them, like I do with the able-bodied team. But my sense, it's very much a blend of neurology, and some of these classes that we learn a little bit about. But I think, gosh, if it was me, and I always kind of think about preparing for the worst, is once you graduate, is taking those continuing education courses that will prepare you for that demographic. So.
Thank you. All right, we have a fun question here. So it was one of the ones that we sent to you. So if you could participate in an Olympic sport, which would you choose and why?
Probably that's like the first choice would be obvious, right? Just because it was sort of a love at first try, I guess, even before PT school. I think for those who are unfamiliar with climbing, it's a beautiful sport to watch. It probably is like most sports that you got to understand some of the rules, but it's pretty phenomenal what some of these climbers can do. And then second to that, I would say and I used to do this as a teen, but wasn't very good at it, skateboarding. And mostly because again, what they can do, and even snowboarders, I just watched Shaun White qualify for Beijing last night, and it just boggles my mind. And I think if, us PTs and PT students, like we can't help but to think, okay, what would we do with that athlete if they had an injury, and how would we rehabilitate them and get them back to sport, and what kind of return to sport progressions would we do, and those things. And so your creative mind just kind of goes crazy. And so that's a sport that it just kind of like triggers that part of me that it's like, wow, that'd be a really fun athlete to work with. But I wish I could just do some of the stuff they could do too.
Yeah, no, that definitely sounds awesome. So before we wrap up, again, I just want to thank you for joining us tonight, the students and Zach. This has been an awesome discussion. It's been really interactive. Can you please share your contact info for anyone who has any other questions that they didn't ask at this event?
Sure. I'll put it in the chat as well, but you can email me at Zach with a K, ZACK, at usaclimbing.org. And then I think Instagram seems to be a popular sort of medium nowadays. And that is just G as in George, and then my last name. And so I'll put that in the chat right now.
Awesome, thank you. And are there any other questions that anyone would like to ask? We're heading to the hour, so I just want to be respectful of everyone's time before we head into the Zoom breakout rooms. If there are no other questions, we do have one more that I think will be an interesting one. So in your opinion, who is the greatest Olympic athlete of all time?
Oh, wow. It's probably like on many people's list, but Michael Phelps. And I think, I mean, we've all seen, especially in the last year or two, how important mental health is, and the USOPC is definitely taking some big leaps. Actually, Tokyo was the first time we've had mental health officers at an Olympics, and so that hopefully that's going to continue being a trend. But the reason I mentioned that is not only from what I observe within our own team, and even the ones that are, being successful, how that kind of messes with you, and the, sort of the chatter that happens because someone is successful. So for me, Phelps to not only win as many medals as he has, but under a surmounting pressure that kept growing. So, it's funny to hear the classic, like, well, I performed really well because I had no expectations. But now then there's expectations. And for him, it was like every Olympics, there was more expectation. And so, the media is not too kind to athletes, and probably some of you has watched the documentary Weight of Gold, and if you haven't, it's really telling. So I think he's not just because of his athletic performance, but how he handled that mentally, I think was pretty impressive. So.
It's a great choice. Thank you for sharing. And again, thank you, Zach, for joining us tonight. For everyone who would like to stay after, we are going to be heading into breakout rooms just so we can connect with each other, talk about how the event went, talk about where we're coming from, any other ideas. So feel free to stay on. If not, then we thank you again for joining tonight.